Here's a question for you. Why were all of the pioneers of the scientific revolution Christians of one sort or another? Catholics, Protestants, occasionally a heretic, but they all believed in God, Jesus, and the Bible. So why were all of the important figures in the scientific revolution, from Copernicus all the way to Newton, why were they all Bible-believing theists? Coincidence is what stupid people think. But super smart people like Dr. Jordan Peterson take a closer look at the connection between the Bible and the scientific revolution, as Dr. Peterson does in his recent documentary, Logos and Literacy, which explores the history and impact of the Bible.
So I hope you enjoy this tour through the history of the world's most significant book.
It's good that someone's investigating this, because the world seems to have forgotten. Now, if you don't know what the connection between Christianity and the scientific revolution is, it's good you clicked on this video, because this will be a crash course on history, philosophy, theology, and obviously science. And by the end of this video, you'll be one of the elite few who know something extremely valuable and beautiful that was once appreciated and celebrated by many, but was suddenly lost, buried, and forgotten, like the Ark of the Covenant. If I may be so bold, you're about to be closer to God, even if you're an atheist. So let's go full Indiana Jones, climb down into the snake-infested well of souls, and take back what was lost. Spoiler alert, all of the pioneers of the scientific revolution being Christians? Not a coincidence. If you want an actual coincidence, let me give you one that will help introduce the topic. A couple months ago, my scheduled reading for a certain Friday was Romans 1 through 3 in the Bible, an article titled On Science and Culture by J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb, and chapter 3 of Francis Schaeffer's short book, Escape from Reason. Watch how this ended up connecting to Peterson's documentary, and then we'll watch some clips from the documentary. If you've read Paul's letter to the Romans, you might be familiar with this passage in chapter 1. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So, since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Effects tell us something about their causes. The created world tells us something about the Creator. What can be known about God through nature is clear enough that people are without excuse when they reject it. Well, if the knowledge of God is so clear that people are without excuse when they reject it, why do so many people reject it? How can they deny the obvious? According to Paul, they suppress the truth. More on this shortly. So that was Romans 1, which I had already read a bunch of times. Then I read an explosive article by the father of the atomic bomb. This was new. Oppenheimer was not a Christian. He was raised as a secular Jew. Later in life, he became interested in a variety of religions, including Eastern religions. But in his article on science and culture, he included a short passage about why he thought the scientific age began when it did. He wrote, "It took an idea of progress, which has more to do with the human condition, which is well expressed by the second half of the famous Christian dichotomy, faith and works. The notion that the betterment of man's condition, his civility, had meaning, that we all had a responsibility to it, a duty to it, and to man. I think that it was when this basic idea of man's condition, which supplements the other worldly aspects of religion, was fortified and fructified between the 13th and 15th centuries by the rediscovery of the ancient world's scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians, that there was the beginning of the scientific age." So Oppenheimer's theory was that there's some sort of drive for human progress built into Christianity, the works side of faith and works. Christians found it meaningful to improve man's condition. Christians therefore took previous discoveries in science and philosophy and mathematics and used them to make the world a better place. Our atomic bomb building friend was partly right, but he didn't come close to explaining the scientific revolution. There's more to science than good intentions. They don't call it a revolution for nothing. Francis Schaeffer got a bit closer. In chapter 3 of Schaeffer's Escape from Reason, he said, "Further, many of the early scientists had the same general outlook as that of Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626. Wow, a guy named Francis quoting another guy named Francis, who said in Novum Organum Scientiarum, man, by the fall, fell at the same time from his state of innocence and from his dominion over nature. Both of these losses, however, can even in this life be in some part repaired, the former by religion and faith, the latter by the arts and sciences." Francis Bacon was a philosophical pioneer of the scientific revolution. He's sometimes called the father of empiricism. He promoted what we now call the scientific method. Bacon was thinking in terms of man being created in the image of God, with the capacity to image God morally and intellectually and by having dominion over nature. But man fell into sin and lost his innocence and his dominion. Through science, man can begin to restore his dominion over nature. So far, this is similar to what Oppenheimer said. We want to make the world a better place, and science can help us do that. But the other Francis Schaeffer, continues, "Therefore, science as science and art as art was understood to be, in the best sense, a religious activity." Science was a religious activity? Notice in the quotation the fact that Francis Bacon did not see science as autonomous. It's not independent of God and revelation, for it was placed within the revelation of the Scriptures at the point of the fall. Yet within that form, science and art was free and of intrinsic value before both men and God. The early scientists also shared the outlook of Christianity in believing that there is a reasonable God who had created a reasonable universe, and thus man, by use of his reason, could find out the universe's form. Now we're starting to get a more complete picture. The world was created by a reasonable God, so we can understand the universe by means of reason. These tremendous contributions, which we take for granted, we sure do, don't we, launched early modern science. It would be a very real question if the scientists of today, who function without these assurances and motivations, would or could have ever begun modern science. Nature had to be freed from the Byzantine mentality and returned to a proper biblical emphasis. And it was the biblical mentality which gave birth to modern science. Interesting question. Could the scientists of today, if they didn't already know what they know, and they were transported back in time to replace the Christian pioneers of the scientific revolution, could they have begun modern science? In other words, if you didn't already believe that the universe had a reasonable creator who created a reasonable universe, and that man, created in the image of God, can understand the universe through reason, would science ever get off the ground? You might say, yes, we would have eventually figured out things regardless. But if that's what you're thinking, you haven't yet understood how massive this problem is. You're suffering from what's called the curse of knowledge. Once you already know something, it's hard to imagine what it's like not to know it. In our time, we already know that the universe is reasonable in the sense we're talking about. A better word here is intelligible, meaning that its fundamental laws can be understood by a rational agent. We've all absorbed the idea that the universe can be understood and the idea that we're the kinds of beings who are capable of understanding it. So it's difficult to imagine what it was like for people who didn't have these ideas. But thanks to history, we know something about the people who didn't have these ideas. We know they weren't very good at science. Isaac Newton famously declared, "If I have seen further than the people who came before me, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Newton understood that part of the reason he was able to figure out so many things was that people who came before him put him in that position. Now, what happens when, instead of mocking those who came before us and patting ourselves on the back for being so much smarter, we instead think about the giants on whose shoulders we're all standing, and we realize that the giants themselves are standing on a foundation of ideas, ideas that provided the foundation for scientific thinking. Doesn't it seem like we might want to take a closer look at those ideas and how they're connected to science? Back to coincidences, the passages we just looked at were my daily reading for November 25th, the same day that the trailer for Jordan Peterson's documentary Logos and Literacy dropped. I watched it that night, and there's an interesting discussion about the connection between the Bible and the scientific revolution. So everything I read or watched on November 25th was making some sort of connection between the Bible and science. It was such a cool coincidence on such an interesting topic that I decided to make a video about it. And here we are. Dr. Peterson's documentary is called Logos and Literacy because much of it deals with how the Bible spread literacy. And there's an obvious connection between the spread of literacy and the spread of science.
Why didn't modern science develop in China? Why didn't it develop in India? Why did it develop in Europe? And why did these men come after 16th, particularly 17th century? Why not in the 15th century?
Excellent questions that no one ever bothers to ask.
This printing of this book changes everything because it begins an intellectual revolution that now, if this is God's word, this has to reform our minds.
So it's not just the spread of literacy, although literacy was an essential component. Something had to change people's way of thinking, giving rise to an intellectual revolution. And today, strangely enough, we think of that intellectual revolution as being fundamentally opposed to religion.
Well, one thing that's quite striking about modern rational culture is this insistence that the religious tradition of the West and the scientific tradition are somehow at fundamental odds.
The religious tradition and the scientific tradition are opposed to one another. This is called the conflict model or the warfare model. It seems to be the dominant model among internet atheists, even though this model is universally rejected by actual historians of science. In other words, novices accept it, experts reject it. And it used to be Dr. Peterson's view.
I mean, I used to believe that, I think, when I was young, at least to some degree. Although now I'm very curious about where that idea came from.
He used to believe in the conflict model, but he doesn't know where he got it. And that's because even psychologists are psychologically conditioned to accept it. But now he's going to go into some problems with the conflict model.
Because it's absolutely clear, first of all, that the universities themselves emerged out of the monasteries.
The university system was a Christian invention that grew out of the monasteries.
Oxford and Cambridge are monasteries for all intents and purposes, and so the whole university idea emerged out of the church.
The universities grew out of the monasteries. Interestingly, the methodology of the universities also grew out of the methodology of the monasteries. Christian philosophers and theologians trying to understand passages of Scripture would propose hypotheses. And then they would test their hypotheses. They would see how well their hypotheses fit the evidence being what the rest of Scripture said. Then someone would modify the hypothesis or come up with a new hypothesis that fit the evidence better. The idea was that through this process of hypothesis testing, they would keep getting closer to the truth. What would happen if you absorbed this method and you applied it to the universe? Hold that thought.
And then the notion that the universe is in fact intelligible and that the pursuit of truth would be redemptive, that's a fundamentally religious idea.
Two completely different points there. One, the notion that the universe is intelligible, that it's capable of being understood by a rational agent, is a religious idea. The pioneers of the scientific revolution believed that the universe was created by a cosmic architect who used mathematical principles to design the universe. Their belief that they could understand the universe was thus connected to their belief about who created the universe. That's a religious idea. 2, the pursuit of truth is redemptive. It's good. Notice, science can be good for certain reasons that have nothing to do with religion. Someone can use science to build an air conditioner to keep a room nice and cool. That's good. No religion needed. But what about scientific research and discovery that doesn't improve our lives in some way? What about learning just for the sake of learning, even if there's no practical benefit to what you're learning? That's still good, and that part's a religious idea. The Christians of the scientific revolution believed that as they were learning about the universe, they were learning about God. In fact, they regarded science as a form of worship. The publication of On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres by Nicholas Copernicus generally marks the beginning of the scientific revolution. Look at what Copernicus says about understanding nature. To know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of worship to the Most High, to whom ignorance cannot be more gratifying than knowledge. So, understanding the universe makes you better.
And then the scientific endeavor itself, given figures like Newton, for example, was embedded inside that religious tradition.
The scientific revolution is embedded in the Christian religious tradition. The same religious tradition that gave rise to the literacy and the universities and the ideas and the values that were essential to that revolution. And yet we're now told that this religious tradition is in a perpetual state of warfare with science. But things weren't always so.
Psalm 111, verse 2. That's the verse which is written at the entrance of the world's first scientific laboratory in Cambridge, Cavendish Laboratory. It says, "Majestic are the works of the Lord. Those who delight in them study them."
Study God's works. Why? It's a form of worship. In Psalm 19 we read, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They use no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth. Their words to the ends of the world."
This idea had already been developing in Middle Ages, which was systematized by Francis Bacon, the father of modern science.
Francis Bacon, remember him?
And he says there is the book of God's words, which is the Bible, and the book of God's works, everything that God has done in nature. So majestic are the works of the Lord, that we should be reading the works of God.
There's the book of God's words and the book of God's works. How were Christians in the monasteries and universities increasing their understanding of the book of God's words? They'd come up with a hypothesis, then test the hypothesis against the evidence, then modify the hypothesis or come up with a better hypothesis. What happened when these Christians turned to the book of God's works? They used the same method. In both cases, there was an external check on their theories.
We cannot confine God to our logic. We have to go out and observe what God has done in his freedom.
What God has done in his freedom. Don't miss this point.
This was the essence of shifting from the old instrument, which is that we can discover scientific truth through logic, to the modern science of Galileo and Newton.
If we didn't go out and investigate, what kind of motion would we expect from heavenly objects like planets? How would we expect them to move? The ancients would say, in perfect circles. A circle was the most perfect, most elegant shape, so obviously to them, that's how the heavenly objects would move. How do objects of different weights fall? Obviously, if you double the weight, you double the rate at which something will fall. Makes perfect sense in your mind. Notice, people assumed they could figure these things out just by thinking about them. The Christians of the scientific revolution believed that God creates freely, not by some sort of logical necessity. So if you want to know how God's universe works, you can't just think about it. You have to go and find out.
We don't know even now to what degree all of those scientific presuppositions are predicated on the underlying Judeo-Christian concept.
That's true. There are a ton of different factors at work. We know that certain Christian ideas played a huge role, but you could get some of the relevant ideas from other places. For instance, Christians believed that human beings are created in the image of God, and that this gives us a capacity to understand the universe. But they also believed that human beings are fallen, so it's going to be a lot of hard work to get things right. The result was repeated experiments. But if you're coming from an atheistic, naturalistic perspective, you could get a similar result. You could say, well, my cognitive faculties aren't perfect. They were selected because they gave my ancestors an advantage in finding food or a mate. They're not really made for science. So if I'm going to use them for science, I'm going to have to be very careful. Either view, Christian theism or naturalism, an atheistic view that the natural world is all that exists, could make you think that you should repeat your experiments. But there are ideas that you get from a Judeo-Christian perspective that you would never get from naturalism.
Because you have to believe the world has an intelligible order. You have to believe in a transcendent object if you're a scientist, or there's nothing to correct your theories.
The world is intelligible. Think about this. If I drop this clipboard, what's it going to do? It's going to fall. We all know that. Anyone in the ancient world could have told you that. But more specifically, what's it going to do? It's going to follow a neat little mathematical equation. Look around you. Everything is following neat little mathematical equations. We talk about the laws of nature. But when we talk about the laws of nature, we're using a metaphor. And that metaphor comes from human governments. The king, or whoever's in charge, makes a law, and people are supposed to obey the law. But Christians believe in a divine king, a divine lawmaker, who created everything, and everything obeys his laws. So, when I drop the clipboard doesn't just fall. It somehow obeys a command. Why, in the name of common sense, would a mindless clipboard obey a command? If you were a naturalist and you didn't already know that this clipboard, no matter what else it does, always follows equations, would it ever cross your mind that it follows equations? Would you ever bother searching for the equations that you have no reason to think are there? No. On the contrary, if someone came up to you and claimed that everything around you is obeying precise mathematical laws, you'd put him in a padded cell, because only a complete lunatic would claim that a bunch of mindless objects are obeying the same mathematics that we can figure out on paper. You know, funny thing about mathematics is a language. It's the simplest, most elegant, most precise language, but it's a language. So if everything around us is obeying neat little mathematical equations all day, every day, then we are constantly surrounded by speech. It's everywhere. You can't look in any direction without being shouted at. Hebrews 1 begins with these words. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. Jesus, the Son of God, is called the Logos, the word or speech, in John 1. The Son, the Logos, upholds the universe by the word of his power. Divine speech upholds the universe. If we want to know what that speech is, what do? We start studying the universe until we figure out what God is saying.
Well, they also believe that investigation conducted in the spirit of truth is redemptive, because every scientist worth his or her salt is operating under the presupposition that the honest quest for truth and enlightenment is in fact a good. And that's a statement, that's an axiom of faith.
It's not just a good, it's worship, according to the Christian pioneers of the scientific revolution. Scientists who came later absorbed the same axiom of faith, even if they didn't realize where it came from.
And all the good scientists that I've known are possessed by a spirit of truth. They will allow the world to correct their erroneous presuppositions, and they do presume that in that quest is to be found, let's say, the betterment of the individual and human society. Those are all religious presuppositions as far as I'm concerned.
So, a collection of ideas gave rise to the scientific revolution. Some of those ideas could be held by different groups for different reasons, but the most important ideas were religious ideas. These ideas could flourish because of the spread of literacy and universities. We can even think of the scientific revolution as one big, methodical, epic test of these religious ideas. The pioneers of the scientific revolution, the giants on whose shoulders modern scientists stand, put their religious ideas to the test. Here it might be helpful to draw a distinction between ordinary scientific hypotheses and the mother of all scientific hypotheses, the ultimate scientific hypothesis that started it all. Ordinary scientific hypotheses are tentative claims about the world, usually based on some sort of observation, claims that are confirmed or disconfirmed as relevant evidence comes in. So you notice that a piece of copper conducts electricity, and you come up with a scientific hypothesis. All copper conducts electricity. Then you test your hypothesis by getting different pieces of copper and seeing if they too conduct electricity. You find out that they do. This supports your hypothesis. There are tons of scientific hypotheses being tested around the globe, but all of these scientific hypotheses are ultimately derived from the mother of all scientific hypotheses. The mother of all scientific hypotheses is the hypothesis on which science, as we know it, rests. There are three key elements of the mother of all scientific hypotheses. 1, the universe can be understood. 2, we are the kinds of things that can understand it. And 3, it's good for us to understand it. If you don't believe that the universe is, at bottom, rational, you're not going to spend years of your life gathering data to figure out its laws. If you don't believe that human beings are capable of understanding the universe, why waste your time trying? If you don't believe that it's good to understand the universe, why would you care? So, intelligibility, the universe can be understood. Capability, we can understand it. And desirability, we want to understand it. These are the three key elements of the mother of all scientific hypotheses, and all three have to be in place for science to get off the ground. In the 21st century, we take these three elements for granted. We believe that the universe can be understood, and that we're the kinds of things that can understand it, and that it's good for us to understand it. But there was a time when the vast majority of people didn't believe these things. They didn't believe that the universe could be understood, or that we could understand it, or that it was good to understand it. And so, even though there were some scientific achievements among the ancient Greeks and the Egyptians and the Chinese and the Muslims, there was never anything that would amount to a revolution in our way of thinking about the world. The foundational ideas that gave rise to the scientific revolution permeated the monasteries and universities before the rise of science, and they were based on the religious views of the theologians and philosophers who were advancing Christian thought. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Christians developed a way of confirming these foundational ideas scientifically. How do you confirm Christian ideas about the universe, about human beings, and about the intrinsic goodness of knowledge by testing lots of ordinary scientific hypotheses in different fields. Every ordinary scientific hypothesis that's tested, whether it's confirmed or disconfirmed, is confirmation of the mother of all scientific hypotheses. The pioneers of the scientific revolution said, in effect, if we're right about the universe, and about ourselves, and about the goodness of knowledge, then we'll be able to figure out physics and chemistry and biology and so on. We were made for this. And every time they tested an ordinary scientific hypothesis, they were confirming that the universe can be understood, that we're the kinds of things that can understand it, and that it's good to understand it. But the set of ideas they were confirming were religious beliefs, and these ideas are indefensible given atheistic naturalism. If it still isn't clear why this is a problem for naturalism, let's compare two hypotheses: Christian theism and naturalism. Again, we suffer from the curse of knowledge, so we have to try to imagine what it's like not to know what we know. Let's do that by applying what's called the surprise principle. The universe is intelligible. Everything is following a set of laws. The laws are mathematical. It's a kind of speech. How surprising is this, assuming that Christian theism is true? It's not surprising at all. It's exactly what we would expect. But how surprising is it, assuming that naturalism is true? Well, if the universe wasn't created by a kind of cosmic architect, an ultimate lawgiver, who upholds all of creation by his speech, why in the name of common sense would you expect the universe to be intelligible? A place where everything is following a set of laws, especially laws that are a form of speech. You would never expect this on naturalism. It makes absolutely no sense on naturalism. So, the intelligibility of the universe massively favors Christian theism over naturalism. But even if you have an intelligible universe, why would you think that we are the kinds of things that can understand it? A human being, unlike a tree or an insect or an octopus or a gorilla, can figure out the laws of nature. How surprising is this, assuming that Christian theism is true? It's not surprising at all. We're created in the image of God. We were created to think God's thoughts after him. We were created to have dominion over the natural world. We were literally made for this sort of thing. We were made for science. How surprising is our ability to understand the universe, assuming that naturalism is true? It's extremely surprising. According to the only plausible scenario given naturalism, a Darwinian scenario, our reasoning ability is the product of natural selection acting on variations within a population. Natural selection favors traits that help organisms survive and reproduce. So, if human reasoning evolved naturally, it's because it helped our ancestors survive and reproduce. Does this give us any basis for trusting our reasoning ability when it comes to questions of theology or philosophy or science? No, our reasoning ability wasn't made for any of that. At best, we could trust our reasoning ability when it comes to finding berries or using a spear against an enemy or doing something to attract a mate. Interestingly, lest you think I'm somehow exaggerating, Darwin himself noticed this problem. He said, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" This is Darwin realizing that the exact same process that gave rise to his mind also gave rise to a monkey's mind. Would we trust a monkey's mind to figure out how the universe works? No. Its mind wasn't made for anything close to that. But a human mind wasn't made for anything close to that either. So, the fact that we're capable of understanding the universe massively favors Christian theism over naturalism. What about the intrinsic goodness of understanding the universe, even if there's no practical benefit to some of this knowledge? The intrinsic goodness of knowledge is in a different category of evidence because goodness isn't something you find with a telescope or a microscope. Saying that understanding the universe is intrinsically good is a value-based claim. But it's a claim that we all seem to agree on. It's a claim that scientists take for granted. It's a claim that's foundational to science. It's a claim that makes perfect sense given Christian theism, where understanding the universe parallels understanding Scripture, and it's a claim that makes zero sense given naturalism. If understanding the universe doesn't help you survive or reproduce, if it doesn't help you propagate your DNA, how can we say, given naturalism, that it's good in any meaningful way? And yet, scientists around the world, even the scientists who are naturalists, are driven by the idea that understanding the universe is intrinsically good. Intelligibility, capability, desirability. If you still don't get how strange these ideas are, given naturalism, it's because you've been Christianized. Christian ideas have become so dominant in your mind that you think they're your ideas, even if you're not a Christian. But if you've absorbed these ideas and you're not a Christian, it seems you're a heretical Christian and not really an atheist. And so there are only two kinds of scientists, Christians and heretical Christians. Same as during the scientific revolution. How do so many people reject and mock Christianity even after their thinking has been thoroughly Christianized? Remember what Paul said, they suppress the truth. Among all our other abilities, human beings have the ability to know that something is true, but to suppress it to such an extent that we reject it and mock it. Now, back to the mother of all scientific hypotheses. The pioneers of the scientific revolution treated their ideas like one giant hypothesis. If we're right about what the universe is and about what we are and about the value of knowledge, then we'll be able to figure this out. And they were right. Notice, every time we confirm or disconfirm a scientific hypothesis, it's further confirmation of that original hypothesis, the mother of all scientific hypotheses. When you confirm or disconfirm a scientific hypothesis, you're providing further confirmation that the universe is intelligible, that we're the kinds of things that were made to understand it, and so on. Every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is confirmation of a set of ideas that flowed directly from Christian theism. If every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is confirmation of a set of ideas that flowed directly from Christian theism, what can we say? We can say that no hypothesis in history has more scientific confirmation than Christian theism. But we can go even further. Since every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is confirmation of the mother of all scientific hypotheses, and as we've seen, all three of the key elements of the mother of all scientific hypotheses are fundamentally at odds with atheistic naturalism, we can say that every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is disconfirmation of naturalism. And since every scientific hypothesis that's ever been tested is disconfirmation of naturalism, it's clear that no hypothesis in history has more scientific disconfirmation than naturalism. The obvious conclusion to draw from all of this is that if we have any respect whatsoever for science, we must accept Christian theism and reject atheistic naturalism. But not so fast. There are two reasons for proceeding with caution here. First, we have to be careful when we talk about evidence confirming something like Christian theism, because Christian theism includes a lot more than just the beliefs that God created the universe and that human beings were created in God's image, and that understanding God's creation is a form of worship or intrinsically good, or, as Jordan Peterson said, redemptive. What's been massively confirmed by science isn't all of Christian theism, but a few particular ideas that flow out of Christian theism. But you get similar ideas from Judaism and certain forms of deism, and we can come up with more worldviews that include these ideas. So, what we can say is that science confirms something Christian theism-ish. Science confirms something that includes the particular ideas we've been discussing. The fact remains, however, that naturalism has been completely, utterly, totally destroyed by science. Second, and this is something that may have occurred to you during this video, what happens when the book of God's words, the Bible, doesn't seem to line up with the book of God's works, the entire universe? What happens when the Bible seems to be telling you one thing and science seems to be telling you something else? Well, the dumbest thing you could possibly do would be to adopt an ideology that contradicts both Scripture and science. So the dumbest thing you could possibly do would be to adopt naturalism. Adopting naturalism would be extreme suppression of the truth. A much, much smarter move would go something like this. Studying the book of God's words led me to study the book of God's works. Christian theism led to the scientific revolution. I can't just kick the legs out from under the giants on whose shoulders I'm standing. So, when there seems to be a conflict between the book of God's words and the book of God's works, I'm going to use the method of the great minds of the past. I'm going to come up with a hypothesis that explains why there seems to be a conflict. And I'm going to test that hypothesis against the evidence. And then I'm going to either revise my hypothesis or come up with a better one until I understand the relationship between the book of God's words and the book of God's works. My understanding of both will increase, and I will know more about God. What we want to avoid here is superficial thinking. Tragically, today's scientists are plagued by superficial thinking. As Francis Bacon once put it, back when science was still considered a branch of philosophy, I dare affirm in knowledge of nature that a little natural philosophy, and the first entrance into it, doth dispose the opinion to atheism. But on the other side, much natural philosophy, and wading deep into it, will bring about men's minds to religion. Wherefore atheism every way seems to be combined with folly and ignorance, seeing nothing can be more justly allotted to the saying of fools than this: there is no God. Or, as a more recent saying goes, the first gulp from the cup of natural science makes you an atheist. But at the bottom of the cup, God is waiting.